First of all, I would like to thank everyone for coming out today. My name is Marcus Ryder. I am the newly appointed CEO of Film and TV Charity. I'm just 7 weeks in, so please be kind. The Film and TV Charity is a charity dedicated to addressing issues around financial, mental, and physical health of people working in film, television, and cinema. We also work to increase equity and address inequalities in the industry. Today, I am looking forward to the discussion, what I believe are two related, but possibly slightly different issues. First, I believe we are going to be addressing sexual harassment in the UK film and television industry and bullying. And secondly, are people in the sector empowered to speak up about the injustices and bad practices in the sector that they either experience or witness? Addressing sexual harassment and bullying should be at the heart of the charity's work, which is why we are hosting this event. When I started this job just 7 weeks ago, someone had left a note on my desk. And it's actually, I brought it in my bag, but it's over there, so I won't show it to you. But it read, and it reads, because I keep it on my desk most times. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream to find out why they're falling in. Now, the charity offers free counselling to address people's mental health problems. We give hardship grants to people facing financial hardship, and we hand out opportunity grants to help people facing inequalities. All important work, but too often that feels like we're just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. Bullying and sexual harassment is one of the reasons people are falling into the river. You can draw a direct line between bullying and sexual harassment and poor mental health. There is a direct connection between financial hardship, not being able to find work, and being a victim of bullying and sexual harassment. Sexism and sexual harassment is the very definition of an unequal workplace. We cannot continue to simply offer balm to people in our industry hurting. We must address the root causes of that pain, and that pain is deep and far too widespread in our industry. And that brings me to the second important related issue. We must make sure people are empowered to be able to speak their truth, because a hidden truth is silence, and injustice thrives in silence. If people cannot speak about their experience of sexual harassment and bullying and other issues that they face, the problems will only grow. And we will continue to just simply pull people out of the river without ever realizing why they're falling in, let alone how to stop them falling in. Speaking out is hard. Ours is an industry built on who you know and interpersonal relationships. We must find mechanisms and build structures that enable people to speak out, to speak their truths, and make sure these issues can be addressed. Because if we do not, we will only repeat the same mistakes, bad practices, again and again and again. I want to end with my favorite Martin Luther King Jr. quote. It also happens to be Obama's favorite Martin Luther King Jr. quote, which is, not I have a dream, but is, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Increasingly, I find myself questioning that quote, or at least I feel it's incomplete. The arc of the moral universe is long. It does bend towards justice, but only through the hard work of morally good people. Today is undoubtedly a gathering of morally good people. Together, let's bend that arc a little more towards justice than it was yesterday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather. I'm one of the reporters at Broadcast, and welcome to today's panel. Before I deep dive into the subjects brought to light in Anna's report, Safe to Speak Up, I've just got a couple of kind of housekeeping things that I want to mention first. So before I begin, I'd like to thank Screen Industries Growth Network at the University of York, both for funding this report and also for helping with this launch event. It's incredibly kind of you, as well as the support from the Film and TV Charity. There will be copies of the report. They're at the back, both the executive summary and the full edition of the report. And secondly, some of the subjects that might come up today are quite difficult, and I'd like to point out that there is a quiet room. It's just around here and up the stairs, so if any of you want to take a time out at any point during this panel or afterwards during the reception, you're very welcome to go up there and take a few minutes. And I'd also like to reiterate the Safer Spaces statement, which means we aim to uphold a space that's inclusive, welcoming, affirming, and respectful of everyone, especially those from minoritized identities. So please be mindful of that, and also please be mindful that there are survivors in this room, as with many rooms. So I would like to ask you to think about that as well when you're asking questions. And just to note, this is also being audio recorded, and it will be available on the Screen Industries Growth Network website soon. So now that I've got that out the way, I'd like to introduce this all-star panel. So next to me, we have Anna Bull, who is the author of this report and a senior lecturer in education and social justice. I'm also joined by Diva Syed. She is senior legal officer at Rights of Women. You launched and run the Rights of Women telephone advice line. It's fantastic. It provides free and confidential legal advice to women in England and Wales who've been sexually harassed at work. Next, we have Jen Smith, who's the interim chief executive of the upcoming independent bullying and harassment watchdog for the creative industries. Its long title is the Creative Industries Independent Standards Authority, but we will be referring to it as CISA during this panel. We also have Philippa Childs, who's the head of BEC2, the creative union for those working in broadcasting, entertainment, communications, and theatre. You also sit on the board at Screen Skills. And finally, we have Lucy Talon from the Film and TV charity. She's the head of mental health and wellbeing, and she created their bullying advice service. So I'm going to stop talking as much now, and we're going to focus on the findings of this report. So Anna, I think it's best if you kick things off by telling us why you carried out the report and what the research tells us.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather, and thanks everyone for coming along to discuss this issue. First of all, why did I carry out the study? We've got various survey-based studies of sexual harassment and bullying in the industry, and these tell us who is likely to be targeted, for example, and in what context. We've also had a lot of media coverage of this issue, which is great. And I'll be honest, some people have said to me, why do we need more research? It's because surveys can't tell us the true picture of people's experiences. Media accounts tend to focus on the spectacular events. They tend to focus on the newsworthy ones. But actually, there are many, many experiences that may not be considered newsworthy, but still need to be heard, and that we can learn from in order to think about how to prevent and respond to sexual harassment. So what I was aiming to do was take a detailed, you could say even forensic, examination of people's experiences since Me Too, so in the past 6 years of sexual harassment and violence in the industry. And I would like to say thank you publicly to everyone who spoke to me for the research, because it takes a huge leap of faith for people to speak out for a study like this. And I think what this approach reveals is a more nuanced account and a deep dive of what's going on, what's working, and unfortunately what's still not working. And I should say the study is not comprehensive, it's not the final word. We still need more work that sheds light on the experiences of minoritized groups, particularly disabled or racially minoritized workers. But a few things that I think the report does illuminate, and of course you can read the full 65 pages and take home a copy if you want to. Basically it reveals, for starters, that sexual harassment and violence are still occurring. So if people want to say, oh, well, hold on, that was 10 years ago, things have changed, we can say, I'm afraid not. Things haven't changed enough yet. But I think revealing how sexual harassment and violence are allowed to keep recurring is one of the things that the report sheds light on. So I found that sexual harassment was recurring. So one incident would occur, And then it would, because it wasn't addressed, it would then occur repeatedly by the same people or in the same workplace. In some instances, I'm talking about sexual harassment or assault happening in public, with people around, with bystanders around, including senior managers sometimes accepting or themselves carrying out these behaviours. So there's a really obvious point of prevention here that we can nip things in the bud a lot quicker. The study also revealed findings about the impacts of sexual harassment and violence. And I think really the main point for me here is that we can't assume that a so-called mild or low-level incident, it was only verbal harassment, isn't going to have a strong impact on people. Because what I found is that people were experiencing impacts based on the longer-term experiences they'd had during the rest of their lives. So some people might have had multiple instances in other parts of their life or at work of sexual harassment and violence, and therefore a mild, quote-unquote, experience could compound these previous impacts. So we can't assume this kind of direct cause and effect. And these impacts also exacerbate the gender inequalities in the industry. So sexual harassment is partly caused by gender inequality, and the report goes into detail about that, but it also in turn causes gender inequality to keep going and to perpetuate. So that's kind of around the experiences of harassment, but then I also wrote about the experiences of reporting. And unusually, out of the 18 interviewees that I did these in-depth interviews with, the majority of them did actually tell somebody at work, and the majority decided to actually tell somebody with a view to getting action taken. So they reported in some way. So the report looks at the factors that inhibited people from reporting, the reasons why they didn't report, and it looked at the things that led people to report. And there is some good news here. Having a culture that encourages people to speak out was one of the factors that supported people to do so. I mean, it's really not rocket science, but it's important to know that. And there is more good news. I found some examples of good practice and how employers responded to reports. There was one particularly good example, which was actually from the only male interviewee in the study, who had a really good experience of reporting. And there were some mixed responses, more nuanced ones. But as we'll talk about shortly, there was a strong reliance on informal reporting. And there were unfortunately some experiences of reporting which you can only call egregious, where there were effectively cover-ups, and including cases where people were encouraged to speak out and then silenced, punished, and victimised when they did so. Hence where the name of the report, Safe to Speak Out, comes from. And so finally, I also asked people to reflect on the mechanisms for addressing sexual harassment in the workplace. And unfortunately, many of my interviewees weren't aware of anything in place in most of their workplaces. And some of them, since Me Too, had worked in maybe 40 workplaces over 6 years and weren't aware of anything in place in those workplaces to address this issue. So it shows we do still have a long way to go. So this report is definitely not the last word in the conversation. It's not the definitive version of events, but hopefully this deep dive shows us some of the places where progress is happening or where we still have further to go.
Thank you. And I can't emphasize enough how worthwhile it is to read the full report to really understand the level of granular detail that goes into that. And ultimately, this work that you've done led to you to conclude that the industry isn't fulfilling its legal obligations to prevent and respond to sexual harassment. So I wanted to ask Lucy and Philippa first how this chimed with your experiences in your work. So maybe Lucy, if I start with you and then go to you, Philippa.
Thank you. So at the Film and TV Charity, we have two main insights into the experiences of people who've been through sexual harassment and discrimination. We do a piece of research called the Looking Glass Survey, which we repeat every 2 years so we can track change over time. And actually when we started in 2020, we asked people about their lifetime experience of what had happened to them since working in the industry. And we also have the Bullying Advice Service, and it's run by Justine, who's sitting in the audience, and I'm sure we'll be happy to talk to people later. And she is there on the front line talking to people who work in the industry, who have experienced a range of different types of bullying, harassment, discrimination every week. and those real stories of people that don't necessarily fit into the sort of classic employment structure. So to talk about the things that resonate, I mean, almost everything you wrote resonates. The experiences that people are going through, the gender imbalances, the power structures, the obstacles that people had found when they're going to HR, the fears that they'd had, that all resonates with us. I will give you a few statistics. Maybe someone can give me a secret signal, like blink twice if I start going too kind of stat heavy. But I think it is useful to think about some numbers. When we did our first piece of research in 2020, the lifetime experience of people who worked in the industry who had experienced sexual harassment, 39% of women and 12% of men. In the most recent survey, which was last year, we asked about people, what have you experienced in the past year? And overall, 12% of respondents said that they'd experienced some sort of sexual harassment or discrimination in the past year. And that went up for, if you were female or non-binary, to 16% of people. And as Marcus said, you know, our big skin in this game is how much it affects their mental health. And we started asking about how much does this affect your mental health, and there was a really big jump between 2021 and 22 of people saying that this kind of treatment had an impact on their mental health, went up from 57 to 69%. And then sort of put the numbers on one side, I can't emphasize enough what our research has shown us time and again is that bullying, harassment, and discrimination is one of the key drivers of poor mental health in the industry. What I wanted to share from the Bullying Advice Service is that we tend to hear from people who are working in a bit more of an ad hoc way, and sometimes that makes them even more vulnerable. So they are not necessarily covered by a contract. They're not working for the same organisation at the same time. So they might be going along for auditions, or people collaborating on a small film, or generating ideas and content. Things happen at festivals. You know, whose responsibility is that? Their contracts can be precarious. I mean, sometimes people don't even know who their employer is. People who've been contracted by a third party, working on SPVs, working for an agency. And there is a real fear around going to HR. And it's not even necessarily based on the fact that they don't think HR is going to be effective. It's because they feel like things might get out of control. And it's such a frightening thing to happen to you that you don't want to get stuck in a sort of, you don't want to get on an escalator and feel like you're being trapped in a process that you're not going to be able to control. Philippa, let me pass over to you.
Thanks. So I agree with much of what Lucy has said, and I always think about it actually in the context of, you know, I've been a trade union official for a very long time, and it's hard enough even in a structured workplace where people are employees and they understand what processes are in place and where to go and who they can speak to and who their trade union representative is. It's hard enough under those circumstances to persuade people that they should make a complaint or they should take it further, because inevitably it's a very difficult thing to do even under those circumstances. But then if you sort of think about it in the context of, I always do it in the context of layers. So if you then think about the fact that the individual might be a freelancer, who might be very junior in the organisation, the perpetrator might be extremely senior or extremely well known in the industry. They don't know what the process is that might apply in their organisation. They don't know where they can go. They don't know who to complain to. They quite often when they talk to us, actually, you know, being entirely frank and honest, Beck too is part of the industry. You know, can they trust us? Can they really be heard by talking to the union? And obviously that's hugely important from my perspective. I want to make sure that people do feel confident and that they are going to be heard and they are going to be supported in whatever way they need. But if you add on top of, you know, a really unpleasant experience, all of those layers of complexity, then I think that explains a lot about why it is so difficult in the creative industries, in our particular industries, for people to feel that they can speak out, that they will be heard, and that they will get a resolution. And I think that also explains why, for many people, many of the stories, the high-profile stories we hear about, people's default position might be to go to the press because they don't understand all of those other, processes that might be available to them. And from my perspective, I want people to come to us, come to all of us, whoever is appropriate, in real time, so that we can actually address some of these issues, so that we don't get a situation where we've got serial perpetrators moving around the industry, continuing bad behaviour. We want to nip it in the bud as soon as it's possible to do so.
Yeah, and I think the kind of core thread throughout all of this is the speaking up aspect of that. And one of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading the report was this reliance on informal approaches when it comes to handling sexual harassment and some of the issues that lay with that. So, Deborah, I wanted to start with you on this one. When is it appropriate to have an informal approach, or what are the reasons and why white people go down that informal route rather than officially reporting something?
Yes. Okay. First of all, congratulations on this really powerful work, Anna, because when I was reading it, I could see how much care and thought you'd put into all of it, and I was nodding furiously along because everything you've said applies to all industries as well, but particularly in film and TV, you can see the specific problems as you've already raised. In terms of informal reports, this is a go-to for all employers very often, but I'll talk about it from the perspective of the victim and the employer. So beginning with the victim, why you might choose to go informally, we've all recognized, we've said this, it's about your relative position of power in the workplace. It's whether you have power relative to the other people in the workplace, relative to the perpetrator. So someone who's very young, someone who's in an insecure, status in the job, they might, don't know where their next job is coming from. Someone who's a person of color, somebody who doesn't have English as their first language. These are all barriers to being able to assert your rights in the workplace. And be able to navigate these systems confidently. It's a very, very lonely thing to do, to raise a sexual harassment complaint. Nobody wants to be a sexual harassment person. Okay, so there is it's very easy to manipulate and kind of put pressure on these people to not make formal reports. And I think it's not fair to put that on a person who has relatively less power in the workplace and then put a further kind of expectation on them that it's okay if you don't want to do a formal report, we can skip the whole thing, which doesn't really benefit the victim. It really benefits the organisation. And what I would say as employers, as people working in the sector, if you are serious about rooting out perpetrators who we know have patterns of behaviour, normally, long-standing patterns of problematic behaviour, whether it's drinking or taking drugs or bullying or racist comments, these people are getting away with it on all different levels, and sexual harassment might be only one aspect of it. Okay, if you are serious about rooting these people out in the organisation from the industry, you have to take every report, and you should want to do a formal process, because later on it's going to be very difficult for you to dismiss that person or discipline that person if everything has been kind of off the books, everything has been kind of minimized. And I could see why employers do this, because there is a bit of a myth that if there's no formal report, then there's no problem. And I think this is a misconception, because I was dealing with a woman the other day, and she'd made no formal report, still able to bring an employment tribunal claim. But I think for some reason employers think, right, well, if there's nothing written down, then we're not liable here, which is a total mistake. And another point I want to raise is just more broadly, if you look at the reasons Well, I was having a look at when we see some of these big high-profile cases, and often you'll get people who have been accused of things, they all make a statement to the media, and one of their favourite things to say is, well, no one made a formal report. No one made a formal report. So what happens is it's weaponized against the victims, and it helps kind of keep a myth going that if you were really a victim, you would have made a report. And the problem is, it doesn't matter how serious the report is, okay? It doesn't matter what the employer is being told, whether it be harassment all the way up to sexual violence. There should be a point where, okay, we're definitely going to do a formal report. But unfortunately, we're still in this position where we're kind of pushing it on the woman's shoulder and saying, well, you know, you don't have to do a formal report, which obviously suits us. And I think your report really highlights this, doesn't it, Anna, that it doesn't work. They carry on perpetrating. And so I think, you know, that should be the exception, not the rule.
Jen, I wanted to come to you as well, because I think a thing that stands out is that, especially in industries like ours, there can be a bit of a lack of structure, and that's something that CISA is looking to address, especially when it comes to informal reporting. So maybe you could touch on that.
I will. Thanks, Heather, and thanks, Anna, for doing this really important research. CISA are really pleased to be there as a very specific and clear recommendation in terms of your work going forward. Just to give you a bit of context, we are not live and open for business yet. We're about 12 to 14 months away, but we are a year into our development, and we will be supporting the industries of film, TV, music and theatre, and specifically our purpose is to support freelancers who may, as Lucy and Philippa have said, find themselves not knowing who their employer is, the production they worked on closed down, they've experienced, you know, horrendous experiences from a serial perpetrator of harm. They turn up on the job, that person's there, where do they report that to? And I think this is really our significant contribution to this conversation, that as well as offering other services and being concerned with bullying harassment and bullying harassment of a discriminatory nature, you will be able to report incidents. And at the moment what we have, as you say, Heather, is that you have partial sight maybe of somebody's behaviour, but you don't have full visibility. And that's what we will bring as a governing body working across the creative industries, because people are a shoal of fish. People move between theatre, screen, music, etc. And now there needs to be that circuit breaker, that dynamically different intervention to ensure that we work with our partners and stakeholders, many of whom have been long-term supporters on this panel, of getting this done, being a professional body that offers advice, support, mediation where appropriate, dispute resolution, but fundamentally and critically being able to report behaviours of concern to a single point of accountability.
Lucy, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, 'cause, there can be kind of layers to this where sometimes maybe an informal response is something that's needed. Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that Justine and I were talking about is when something happens, first of all, an informal response should be an option to start off with, because you should always have the option of talking to someone confidentially. As you say, you don't want to step on this escalator and it get out of control, but you need to know what the options are, of what it's going to look like, what's going to happen next, what's the time frame going to be, what are the options for maybe monitoring something, what will the outcomes be. On this particular question about approaches to handling these kind of reports, there's a wider problem here that we've kind of identified, and it's about the ability, the actual tangible ability, the skills and experience that people in those positions have to handle these reports. And I feel like that's something that we don't talk about very much. And we actually added in some questions last year. God, I'm doing it again, talking about the survey. But
We love stats.
I can't help it. Approximately a third of people, we asked, do you have responsibility for other people's well-being in your job? And that doesn't, whether you're a freelancer just on a job, so you can, you know, you're not an employer per se, but you are a line manager. And about a third of people who said that they did, said that they had had something brought to them in the past year, whether it was formally or informally. A third of them said, yeah, I had something brought to me. Under half of them, said that they felt they had the knowledge and skills to deal with that. More than half of them said, I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. And of those people, 2/3 said that they felt that training would help them with that. And I think that's something that we don't talk about very much, in that if you sort of take, there are some systems that don't work, and obviously if you're reporting in, to someone and it's the boss of the company, there are kind of malign influences. But actually there are a lot of just ordinary humans out there trying to do a good job, and they don't know how to do it properly. And they're quite afraid to say that as well. They're quite afraid to speak up, to say, I don't know what to do. And I think there needs to be more talk around that. I was talking to someone who used to be the MD of a very, very big production company. And he said, every time we've done a production, we sit around, we talk about how that production went, we moan, we didn't get the slot we wanted, this didn't go so well, that went really well. We don't talk about the management issues. He said, I don't think I've ever sat down and gone, that thing that was brought to so-and-so and we handled it like that. Do you think we handled it right? And there's a fear around talking about that. There's a fear around saying, do you know what? I don't actually know what to do. And I think that the more that we talk about that, the more likely people are to get the training that they need. It's not obviously all about training. We have a framework on our website called Listen, Acknowledge, Act, and there are some basic skills that you can be skilled up in. For example, there's a resource on active listening. But, you can be trained on things like very basic mediation. And so I've talked about skills. I want to very briefly touch on policies and processes. Things are getting better policy-wise, and as we see, policy is a necessary but not sufficient condition to have in place. And policies are still quite vague, and they tend to say, this is the definition. If you're a line manager, try and fix it informally, and if you can't, have a formal complaint. And again, people are a bit like, well, what does that look like? How do I apply that to this very real life situation that's happening today? Do I press stop on the whole production? We've only got 2 hours of light. What does that mean? And then the process as well. Again, it's about applying a policy to a real life situation. Even having some sort of framework, so again, we have one of our resources gives a very sort of basic idea of tiers. How do I categorize this? Is this really serious? How do I acknowledge it to the person? How do I say, yes, we've heard this shouldn't have happened. These are the things that could happen next. You'll be in control of the situation. And just having some sort of framework and feeling like they're supported by the HR, by their management, is really, really important. And I would ask, and I wonder if everyone sitting here, and I know people have different roles in the audience, but if you went back to your office this afternoon and someone said, look, I need to tell you about something that's happened, do you know what you would do next? What you would do before you went home? Do you know who you go and talk to? Do you know what the policy is? And I think we all have a responsibility to be much more prepared and to skill ourselves up if necessary. And also to be unafraid to say, you know what, I don't know what to do. But it's incumbent on us all to try and be part of that solution.
There's a lot of very enthusiastic head nodding. I'm going to go to Anna because I can see you're itching to say something.
Sorry, I thought you wanted to jump in.
I did, because I wanted to get one thing in the panel that I'd said to you earlier. That's such a valid point that people don't know what to do. And my experience of doing this work for the last few years is that employers tend to either massively underreact or overreact because there is genuine panic when this happens. And we've got to put it in the broader context that, Me Too has become a culture war kind of issue, and people are terrified in a variety of ways. They're worried about mistreating or accusing people who haven't done things, but they don't know how to support. And so that's why, an organisation like Rights of Women, we're keen to put this in the broader context of, sexual harassment. As Anna highlights, it's a symptom and a cause of gender inequality, and the way that reports are responded to are, unfortunately, it's steeped in misogyny and sexual violence myths, what we would call rape myths or sexual violence myths, which is people working off presumptions or misconceptions about how these things actually work. And that's hugely problematic because if we're all not singing off the same hymn sheet, this is how we find that when women do report, they are often treated really appallingly. They're treated with a lot of hostility, a lot of suspicion, and there is often an organisation kind of can find themselves pulling rank or protecting themselves rather than the victim. So, I mean, there's one thing I really want to highlight in Anna's report, when she talks about particularly informal reports, but it would be great if you would all go away and have a think about this concept of himpathy, which is, and I mean, I'll let Anna, maybe can you explain it a bit better than me?
It's a term that an American writer, Kate Mann, uses, which means excessive sympathy for men who are accused of or who have perpetrated sexual violence or harassment, when we don't extend that same sympathy or imagination to the women or the people who are affected by that.
And I think your report highlights this really well, because their experiences talk about how the response from the person they raised it with was steeped in himpathy, which is, sort of a desire to give the perpetrator a benefit beyond the, what do you call it? The benefit of the doubt, far beyond is actually it's worthy. They're worthy of having. So these concepts are really important, and we need to educate ourselves about these things if we're reporting or receiving reports of sexual harassment, because they're interplaying with how seriously we treat them and what we do next.
Yeah, so just briefly to follow up on that. I mean, I love being on a panel where everyone else is saying what I want to say. It's very exciting. But alongside the report, there's also a piece of guidance for employers, which Deborah has contributed to, which has a bit more detail on responding to informal reports, or informal responses to reports, signposting to the film and TV charities resources, and also what to do when there's a report that is also a criminal offence. Because that's another area of complexity. So that one should be up. It should have been up on the website today, but it might be tomorrow. And there is also a policy briefing for next steps for regulation at the back as well. So I just thought it was a good moment to mention those.
Oh, mention it. I wanted to move on to say that the kind of key question in this report is what has changed since Me Too, and you guys have already given some really constructive ways in which people can change their behaviour. And the report describes some positive steps and some positive attitude changes, but not as much change as perhaps might have been expected, and maybe even some complacency. So that includes a kind of the continued use of non-disclosure agreements and other problematic tools in the workplace. So how can we ensure that progress does continue? And Anna, if I start with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason I wanted to carry out this study is that, the people I spoke to, the interviewees, have a privileged perspective because they have experienced and in some cases attempted to report sexual harassment or violence since Me Too. So they've got this perspective. They're really, a litmus test of whether things have got any better. And there is some good news, I think, which is that there was a lot of evidence of a shift in attitudes. But this was much more marked among younger people in the industry. It's almost a generational divide emerging, I think, with younger people, and particularly the 20-somethings, and to some extent those in their 30s, having very different perspectives. I mean, one of my interviewees, who was line managing a lot of younger people, even said, the 20-somethings, they're going to save us. This group are expecting employers to have robust processes in place. They're holding employers to a higher account. They're supporting each other to speak out. They're active bystanders. And there's a bit of a divide between what this kind of younger generation expect and what employers sometimes think should be in place. So, in one case, an employer, from the interviewee's perspective, seemed to think they'd done a really great job of handling their report, and the person I spoke to was like, they have no idea of all of the issues that arose. So I think, employers need to realise that the 20-somethings are not messing around on this issue. And so I think the clearest shift is, it's almost a moral imperative to speak up, but it's not. It's often speaking up on behalf of others. So there's a really positive sense of collectivity emerging. But I think the problem, as reflected in the title of the report, is that there's a kind of encouragement to speak up, but it's not necessarily safe to do so, and all of what you were saying about having structures in place is not yet there. People are being encouraged to report to what I would call unsafe organisations.
And Philippa, if I go to you as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the question of complacency, because I think there is huge complacency. I'll just give you an example. I wrote to all of the broadcasters post the Russell Brand reports recently, and said I was very concerned, said I would like to meet them, and that we should be having a joint review of their processes. And I think without fail, I got, and I also talked about CISA and our support for CISA, and encouraging them all to commit to CISA, because I think at that stage they hadn't all done so. But the responses that I got were all about, we're confident that our processes are robust. We've got our reporting line, which people can complain to, and you know, all of those things suggest to me complacency, but they also suggest that there is not a real in-depth understanding of, you know, what it takes to get somebody to feel confident to report. And 9 times out of 10, I would argue that an anonymous reporting line, when you don't know who you're speaking to, what's going to be done with that information, where it's going to go, is not going to be helpful. So I think there is quite a lot of complacency. And then if you take that step further and talk about their responsibility for things that happen on their productions, then I think there's even more complacency, quite frankly. So I think there is, sadly, and I do think it goes back to the issue of gender inequality, that you know, some of the people, obviously, within those broadcasters who deal with some of these issues or respond to me are fairly senior men, and I think there is a real issue around that. What encourages me, obviously, is everyone sitting around this panel and everyone in the audience who I know is committed to making change in the industry. And I think what we really need to focus on are the building blocks to fill the gaps, to make sure that there are processes that people know about, understand. There is training for managers, there is support for individuals when they want to complain. So yes, to my mind, it's about putting in place building blocks, and I think there has been some progress in that, although I'm sure, like everyone else, I completely despair at times when there is a new report about something that has been going on in plain sight.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you mention Russell Brand, because obviously we covered that at broadcast, and a lot of the industry responses were, you know, these allegations happened between, was it 2003 and 2007? Actually, your report is from, was it December 2017? Yep. So, you know,
we had no formal report.
Yeah, and there's 18 respondents in this who have had things happen in the last 5-6 years.
And in many cases, multiple incidences.
Exactly. And Lucy, I also wanted to ask you in terms of your opinion on how we can ensure progress continues.
Yeah, those building blocks are important, aren't they? And sometimes the complacency is frustrating, and you think on the one hand you're getting people to speak up, the onus is on you, something terrible's happened to you, speak up. But actually the mechanisms aren't there to make sure that the right thing's going to happen. But those building blocks, and I remember something you once said, Jen, you know, we are stronger when we work together. There is work going on in the background, and I do feel genuinely positive, and I do want to give a shout out to some bits of work that are going on, and none of these things on their own are a magic bullet, but they do add up to us trying to work together. I mean, the really big thing is CISA, and I think we're all excited about that. What it's going to do, but just also what it stands for. You know, this is going to make a real impact. You know, we fully support the policy work and the support from BECTU, from the BFI, from BAFTA. I think it's brilliant that BAFTA have included having a bullying and harassment policy in their eligibility criteria. I mean, that on its own isn't going to solve anything, but you know, this is how you get this thing on people's radar. This is how it starts seeping into normal life. There is some great training out there. Screen Skills have got their module. A shout out for BIFA, who do some really good follow-on training from that e-module. In terms of policies, you know, we've noted, we do ask and say, are you aware that your organisation has a clear bullying and harassment policy? Those numbers have gone up a little bit, to be honest. It's not statistically significant, and it's still only around a third of people, and that's just nowhere near enough. The bigger thing is that about 80% of people, when we last asked them, sensed a positive change in culture and behaviours in the industry. And I do think that's something that we can probably all relate to in some way or another. Things are getting better. Thank God for Generation Z. I mean, when it comes to mental health, they just don't put up with the same shit that a lot of people have put up with. And it's quite interesting, actually. There's a lot of research in America. I mean, the actual financial trade-off people are prepared to make from the younger generation about the kind of jobs, the kind of remuneration that they'll have because of the kind of treatment that they expect to have at work. And so that is positive for the future. I think I also should mention that we have something called the Toolkit for Mentally Healthy Productions. And trying to come at this from the sort of carrot rather than the stick angle, it all starts with trying to set a positive culture, and there are lots of dynamics to that, but setting that positive, healthy, inclusive, respectful culture in your workplace is where it all begins. And I think we all know what that looks like. It's difficult to document it, it's difficult to prescribe it, but you want to be a decent human being, and the toolkit can help you do that on productions. There are other tools. There's a really cool app called Call It, which is a good way for people on productions, for exec producers, to understand what's happening on their production. So there are these things that are going on, and I think they add up to a movement, and I'm also really heartened to be here. But I guess that the last thing I wanted to say is having a positive culture, it requires the tone to be set by the leaders, by those people that you wrote to, Philippa. And they need to not just get it themselves, they need to constantly reassure the managers, the people in the middle who are the ones making the difficult decisions day on day on day, having the stuff brought to them, but also having to report up, stick to the budget, stick to the timetable, and reassure them, I've got your back. You know, these are really difficult issues, and your values as an organisation are only tested in really difficult situations. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to empower the people in the middle who have the stuff brought to them, and are they going to make sure there's a formal complaint made? Is it documented? You need to constantly reassure them, I've got your back. This isn't just talk. This is how we want our organisation to work. So I too am really looking at the people at the top to not just set that, not just say it once, not just say it in response to an incident, to a letter, to be saying it all the time.
Brilliant. One real issue that kind of crops up is this idea about what employers can do when there's rumours and there's secondhand information, and they might not have necessarily had someone come directly to them, but they're aware of something. So Jen, I wanted to start with you by asking kind of what employers can do and what should happen when there's rumours of something, but there's not necessarily a concrete report. How can people act on that?
It is really a challenging question, and it's something that we get asked a lot, because CISA has to be driven by evidence, by fact, by investigation, etc. You'll understand that. But I think what we can do, and part of the work that we will do with employers, is to create a framework of what good looks like. We're just about to onboard a COO who's very skilled in this arena, who will look at the operating model, and that will be something where I think we will be able to offer some future detailed advice, because it is something that crops up very frequently, but obviously we want to encourage that safety of environment where people can give their accounts, and that you aren't having to act on rumours or have a rumour but not know where to place that. So it's a really challenging issue. It's something that CISA will take on down the line, and we will be able to offer advice to individuals and people seeking advice on behalf of another individual, and also employers, in terms of what to do in those circumstances as we advance our detailed operating model.
Yeah, and Deborah, I wanted to come to you on this as well, in terms of, what should happen when there are rumours and no reports, and also ensuring that when you report sexual harassment that it is worthwhile and that it will go somewhere.
Yeah, that is such an important point, right? Because I think it gets to the real crux of your report, Anna, which is, what happens when the woman actually reports? Because I think we need to push the conversation further on from just report, because I know from my work that women who report, and I'm saying women just because that's what I support, obviously it can be other people in it, but particularly women who report experience very, very poor outcomes. I'm often on the phone to women saying, I wish I'd never said anything. They do not, what you were saying, Philippa, I think about, they don't realise the can of worms, the Pandora's box that they are opening. They come to the employer in good faith, telling them, I'm the innocent person here, please do something about this person. They're intervening with my ability to do my job, to work effectively, and they're often horrified to find out that, to find the employer turning against them, wanting to kind of suppress it, treating them as the problem. And we're currently in a system where reports, if they're not handled properly, if the investigator isn't, properly trained, the woman can experience further traumatization just from the process. Okay, and that is, I'm probably the best person to talk to about best practice, because I see the worst of it, because we're on the front line seeing that. But that's true across the film and TV industry, but also all industries. So you're all in the same boat on that. What I would say in terms of rumours is, you can always investigate. You can find out more. You can ask questions. You can, it's on you to get the information that you can act upon, right? In a way, it's a good thing, because there's not restrictive rules in the same way that you can take it as seriously as you like. And some organisations do. So they, depending on what they've heard, they would, create an environment where women want to come forward. And in terms of it being worthwhile, it's not just about good culture practice. People want to see that there has been a point in coming forward, that maybe someone has been held responsible, that maybe someone has been disciplined, maybe someone has been dismissed if that's appropriate, but also what's the organisation doing differently? What have you actively done to say, right, what are we doing to make sure this doesn't happen again? We're aware of this now. It's a risk. So I think you talk about this in the report as well. You need to treat this as an ongoing risk that's always live. And there are things you can do. So my advice would be to be curious and create that environment where women feel like it's worthwhile to come forward.
And Philippa, as head of Bectio, I just wanted to pick your brain on this as well.
Yeah, so I agree that it's quite complex, but I also agree that being curious, asking those questions when people hear rumours is an important thing, and I think that's actually a really important point to get across to employers, because I think there does tend to be a tendency to fall back on, oh, well, I haven't had a formal complaint, so and people know that things are not right or there's stuff going on in plain sight. So I think all of what we've talked about today about having conversations about this issue and this problem, and making sure that people, yes, that they know where to go and how to report and what the process is, but also actually just having a conversation about what a healthy workplace looks like and what respect for everyone looks like, I think is as important almost as those processes and procedures.
Yeah, fantastic. So I've just got one final question quickly, and then we're going to move on to audience questions. So if you start having a think about anything that you might want to ask the panel, is a very difficult question, and we've kind of been touching on it throughout, but what needs to change now? The report argues that broadcasters and commissioning channels need to do more. There's, a worker protection bill being passed. Anna, and I start with you, and maybe we'll kind of go down the line
of what stands out to you as what needs to change now?
Yeah, I'll keep it quick because this is one I could talk about for a while. This is a marathon, not a sprint, I think. And unfortunately, the Worker Protection Bill, which has now been passed, Worker Protection Act, has left out some key changes that are urgently needed, such as, can you believe the time limit for reporting sexual harassment is 3 months? I mean, I don't need to rant to you guys about this, but it's, that's still in place, unfortunately. So kind of wider legislative protections are still inadequate. And in the policy briefing that's available at the back of the room, I've suggested some kind of broader ways forward for regulation. I think the Health and Safety Executive should get involved in this issue. Sexual harassment and violence at work as a health and safety issue. What a radical idea. And that's something that currently they don't do. And we need a lot more data. So things like the Call It app or anonymous reporting can be helpful for gathering data, even if sometimes it's difficult to act on those issues.
Agreed with all of that. So Rights to Women, along with other, equalities organisations, the trade union movement, we campaigned for the law to change, which will put a positive duty on employers to proactively prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, and we fought and we have won that now. So the Worker Protection Act has passed and it will be in force in October next year. So all employers, regardless of the size of your organisation, will be expected to be taking reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So that means if you get a report or you hear a rumour, you're doing something. You're actively doing something all the time, like all the other legal obligations you do to keep your workers safe, and other regulations that you have in the film and TV. It's actually loads of things you have to do. So this will just be one other thing that you will all be required to do, and I hope that looks like having a policy in place, having training in place, making sure everyone's doing that in their induction, and you will all be required to do that, but hopefully willingly.
Thanks. I think legislative change is an important piece of backdrop scaffolding that we need on these important sensitive areas, but CISA will provide that circuit breaker, being that place, that one single place of accountability where you can report behaviour that may be harmful but not criminal to a single entity that can then investigate it. And we are there to address gaps in provision and create best practice. Some of the points that Philippa said about complacency, we are very keen to have a read across around complaints policies and procedures around all the employers in the sector and say this is what best practice looks like. We're here to create consistency and coherence in terms of where you go, working with our partners very, very closely, not duplicating great provision that exists already or the important work of the helplines and the unions, but addressing those gaps in provision where things don't exist. So at the moment, there is no single one place that you can go, and we get to this point, as you know, of partial sight of somebody's behaviours, but not full visibility, and that is what we will be addressing. And now we're moving into our detailed design for the next 12 months, which will be based on lots and lots of consultation with freelancers, with yourselves, in terms of the services, how we provide them, what they look like, the process flows, real transparency about what will happen, the options available to you, whether you're reporting formally or informally. That's the work that we do now to breathe CISA into existence. But a year ago, we were a concept on a page, and now we're a company limited by guarantee. We're moving into recruiting our board and governance structure next year. We're hiring to senior roles. We are identified, not just in Anna's important research, but in the sector vision by government, that this will happen. And equally, this is something that has overwhelmingly been spoken about from the freelance community, saying, we want this, get on with it. So, we look forward now to moving into that detailed part of designing what our services will look like and talking with you and working with you to build out CISA that has a meaningful impact on dealing with poor behaviour, but over a longer period of time, professionalising behaviours and conduct and how we engage with each other in the industry that we all love.
Thanks, Jen. And just to add to that, I think one of the things that has been great in the last however long it's been. And the part of the reason that CISA exists is that the whole of the creative industries have come together to talk about this issue, to recognise that things actually do need to change and that there needs to be some concrete proposals in place. I suppose I'll just be a little bit parochial for a little while and just say that what I'm very conscious of is I talk about this a lot, but I also head up an organisation of lots of volunteers and officials who support those members who work in the industry. And, you know, am I totally confident that all of our representatives are equipped to respond effectively when somebody comes to them with a complaint to say that they've had a bad experience? No, I'm not. And am I confident that all of our, you know, we've got some very junior officials who are the sort of front line in terms of supporting members. Am I totally confident that they would all consistently be able to respond to those complaints? No, I'm not. So I think what I've been thinking about is how we can make sure that they are better equipped to be able to respond effectively, so that people do feel that if they come to Bectu, they are supported, advised, and given the confidence in order to take their complaints forward.
I think everything's been said really from the point of regulation and legislative change. We're really in support of CISA. I wonder if there needs to be a little bit of a shift in the way that we think about HR, what HR is for, who HR is for, and those softer skills, those HRE skills that we expect line managers to have, that actually if you talk to people who work in kind of occupational psychology and workplace bullying, those soft skills are probably the hardest things to teach. You can teach people how to do spreadsheets and you can teach people how to do technical skills, but those human skills, which are the things that are needed to pick up situations, because you will always have conflict in any workplace that involves humans, particularly in a creative one. I think that recognising that that is part of your job, and recruiting, retaining and rewarding people for having those skills is a big shift that I think we could move towards.
Thank you so much, guys. These guys are brilliant, aren't they? But I'm going to move on to questions from you guys now. I think somewhere we have a roving mic, so if... Yeah, would you mind taking that one? A mic from somewhere. Fabulous. So if you could just wait until you have the microphone. If you're feeling brave, you can introduce yourself. And I'll also ask, or remind even, to be sensitive in your questions, so maybe don't kind of name individuals or companies, just ask your questions to the panel. So I don't know if anyone wants to go first. No? Someone there?
Hi. Hi, thank you. My name's Sophie Wilkinson. I'm a journalist. I've worked on a couple of stories exposing certain men in the industry, and I'm delighted that their names have got out there. It's been really, really hard work to do that, to investigate it. And I guess this goes to everyone, but I'm curious, Philippa, because the way you spoke about people going to the press rather than coming direct to Bectu, I'm just wondering whether it's appreciated that there is a grey space in which harassers and predators act, which is they go past the criminal threshold potentially, but not enough for the police to be able to deal with it. We know that some people are waiting up to 5-6 years from reporting to actually being in court with the person they allege to have hurt them. Yes, so there's this grey space where things go beyond criminal, that threshold of criminality, but not enough for the police to be able to do anything sufficient. Where can Bectu and every other organisation here kind of step in and help in those sorts of situations? Because that's where I think that's the hardest stuff to tackle, and I do think that's the stuff that actually, when journalists can get over the line, we really can get it over the line there.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't mean to be critical of the work of journalists, because without some of those stories, then we wouldn't know about certain people and they would still be operating in the industry. I think what I was trying to get across is that the sooner that people report, and particularly if they feel able to do it in real time, then the sooner we are going to be able to support them, nip that behaviour in the bud, and try to deal with the particular complaint. But I absolutely recognise that there are those spaces where time has elapsed, as we discussed, and it is really difficult to be able to find a solution that people find acceptable. I think. Are you going to?
Shall I briefly, and then I think Deepa maybe. Really important question, and actually in the guidance for employers that accompanies this report, there's a specific focus, and thank you, Deepa, for your contributions to this, on what happens when it's a criminal offence, but may not be reported to the police. Now, sexual harassment may or may not constitute a criminal offence, and regardless of this, employers still have to deal with it. So it's no longer acceptable, as it may have been acceptable 10 years ago, for employers to say, oh, that's a criminal offence, we can't do anything. That is not acceptable. Employers still have to act regardless of whether it's reported to the police. It's a really tricky situation, because we're getting more of these situations where the police are maybe no criming it, or there's no action taken for a long period of time. Employers still have a duty to keep people safe at work and to prevent further harassment and violence occurring. So I think this is a big change that we need to get employers to think about. And I don't know if you want to add anything, Deepa.
Yeah, fantastic question, because I think your question, when it goes, the heart of your question is, where's the accountability? Because women are, the reason they've come to the journalists is because their organisation, is not taking it seriously. They are and we support these women all the time, but they're desperately looking for somebody to hold this person to account. And my honest opinion is, if they had wanted to go to the police, they would have gone to the police. Everyone knows the police is there. What they're doing is they're coming to the organisation where they work, because they're saying, I don't want this person to work here anymore. I don't want this person to be a potential danger to my colleagues, to my peers in this industry. I want you to take responsibility and hold that person to account. And they struggle to be able to do that, which is why they go to the press, because they hope the press will put some pressure on the organisation. Or the police is an option, but we see it's far too common for employers, especially, this is a sexual violence myth, this is a rape myth, which is, if you've been assaulted or raped, you're supposed to go to the police. Even though we've seen coverage for the past few years about how few police reports end up in a prosecution or a charge. We know that that is a very poor, that option is probably not going to happen for the women, for the victim. That this person will ever see a prison, very, very unlikely. What's much more likely, though, is that they can get what they're hoping is that they can get some accountability from the employer or the industry. So on your point specifically, Sophie, it's really important to not assume that because somebody hasn't been able to meet the threshold, the evidentiary threshold, which is incredibly high, of a police investigation, that what happened to them, didn't happen to them. And we see far too often that if somebody can't get a police investigation off the ground, this is seen as some kind of exoneration. Nothing we can do here, turn the other way, but it's completely not the case. And the recommendations go into detail about why that is. But it's wrong to kind of to assume that somebody else should be taking responsibility for it. At the end of the day, you're the employer, it happened in your workplace, and you could be liable for it, and all your other employees are potentially at risk. So there is things that can be done, and there's got to be multiple routes to accountability.
I think, if I can just add, this is exactly the accountability gap that CISA is seeking to address, where behaviour is deeply harmful but may not be criminal, but people want to report it and have advice about what they do about it. And equally, there have been people who have spoken to me who have had horrendous experiences which would-be criminal behaviour that they've experienced, and said that had there been more support for them from an independent body, they may have chosen to go to the police. So that's another service that CISA will provide. So this grey space, this really challenging area that you describe, is something that CISA is seeking to address when we go live next year.
I think there was someone in the front here.
Thank you. I'm Holly Miller. I work at a PR agency for film and TV industries called Percy & Warren, and we've been involved with this on the PR side. So I've been speaking to you, Heather, about this before, and Anna. But something that stands out to me listening to this and watching all of you on the panel, it's just incredible. And Anna, the report is just amazing. And I'd say long overdue, but I think this will be a piece of work that evolves, through the rest of time. And it's amazing to see all of you incredible women on the stage in a very female-heavy room. But one thing that is sort of not overlooked, but the inherent kind of cause of this problem are perpetrators, not always men, not all men. I work with brilliant men in the industry who haven't sexually harassed me, but there is a big onus with this entire conversation on the victims and on witnesses, and not on the perpetrators. And I guess I'm sort of taking a long time to get to my point or question if I ever get there, but there's this, I think, work that is needed, and I'm sort of saying this rhetorically, to whether, not just inherently if you're a man in a sort of heavily male-skewed industry, but if you are benefiting in this industry from any sort of power structure, whether you're a senior woman in the workplace or a senior man or a man of whatever sort of position, anything like that, if you've been in a company longer, if you have a permanent contract versus a semi-permanent contract or things like that, there are these power structures that you are upholding. And I think there is a fear of opening up any conversation around problems that you perpetrate for fear of being cancelled or being fired or opening this kind of can of worms. So there is this kind of grey area between these kind of sackable criminal offences, which are horrible, and I hope fewer and further between. But there's this sort of rest of the space which kind of, I think, enables a sort of locker room behaviour. And you're saying that there are these casual kind of public displays of sexual harassment or bullying that there's never anything done about them. And I have been there, I've felt that, and it's because I don't want to sort of whistleblow because that person is my friend or has been good to me or something like that. So there's this whole kind of grey area of, I think, and a piece of work that needs to be done, and I'm sort of calling on people in positions of power, whether they're male or not. I will stop rabbiting ASAP, I hope. But to question what you are upholding, to invite that kind of criticism of you without it feeling like it will be the end of the world. And I guess if you don't feel like you are on the receiving end of any bullying or harassment, you should look at yourself and open up that conversation without it feeling like it would be the end of the world or you'd be arrested or something like that. So what I'd like to finish on is just a question for the panel. I don't know if anyone has any ideas in their kind of line of work or this process of the research, but are there any ways that we could start asking men or people in positions of power to open up the floor and say, have I ever done anything that's made you feel uncomfortable, or that you would like me to be aware of, puts you in a position of feeling vulnerable, anything like that? How do we start the conversation and that process from the other side without it feeling like you could be walking to the gallows or something? I hope that makes any kind of sense, but it's sort of flipping the perspective there of how can we take the onus and take it away from just being on victims or witnesses.
Any of you want to jump out first?
I think it's a brilliant question and a really interesting statement going forward. And there's a quote that I'm really fond of by Dr. John Amici about culture being defined by the worst behaviours tolerated. You know, what are we willing to carry on tolerating in the creative industries? So part of our work, as well as the accountability, as well as the deterrent value, as well as the advice, etc., is that long-term professionalisation of behaviours. CISA is for everybody, but that's what we want to see. You know, we want to be able to have conflict in a healthy way. We want to be able to have the lexicon to have these difficult conversations around behaviours, etc., in a a really productive manner, and that's part of how we will drive our work forward. You know, having a single place for best practice, pointing people to the right place, but also, you know, just raising the bar of expectation, I think, over time is really important for us. And just, you know, moving on from that, this is okay, because that's the prevailing norm of behaviours in our sector. We've moved beyond that now, and I think you're right, we can't leave it all to the next generation, as brilliant as they are. We've got to take action now and set the example, and I think that's happening, and that's why I'm really excited to work with my partners on the panel and build this new organisation that will play, I hope, a pivotal role in changing everybody's experience of working in the creative sectors.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so I do think that creating that sort of culture where people feel comfortable to challenge or to have those conversations, I think that is to a large extent about leadership. And so I think you have to have that commitment from the leadership of whatever organisation to make sure that their organisation is healthy in terms of having those conversations, that they make it clear about what behaviour is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. And then I also think, I agree with Lucy about redefining the role of HR, because I think we've got to a sort of place where HR is just seen as defending the organisation from whatever the complaint is, and making sure that the organisation is not put at risk. And I think actually there needs to be more emphasis on talking to managers, talking to people about the culture they experience, and giving managers more confidence to challenge people, and everyone, in fact, to have more confidence to challenge people. So I think it is, it's quite a big piece of work, but I think it is an important piece of work, and I think that's the only way, actually, that we're going to really change the culture of the industry.
Lucy, that kind of touches on something you were talking about earlier in terms of the kind of managers knowing what to do in a situation.
Yeah, and setting positive culture. I talk about positive culture so much. You know, you say words and they sort of they sort of lose their meaning. What does it mean? How do you create that positive culture? And in answer to your question, how do we create that? Here's a couple of really practical examples. I mentioned something called the Toolkit for Mentally Healthy Productions. It's just for production. I'm always sort of slightly embarrassed, which I shouldn't be, because I work for my organisation, to say, well, my organisation has done this. But it's out there. It was developed by the industry. People are trialling it, and I'd love to know what you think of it, actually. So at the beginning of a production, there is a template for how to have a meeting about well-being, about creating a positive space. And it's so simple, but I'm going to let you into a secret with kind of well-being and mental health. There's no magic answers. Actually, you look at things and you go, oh, is that it? And then you try it and you go, God, that made a difference. And it's about setting the tone. So it's how to have that meeting. There is a well-being memo template, and it's setting that expectation at the top. So that's one thing. The other thing that just popped into my mind when you were talking is when we did that first piece of research, we were gathering evidence. So we did desk research, we did quality evidence, we did the survey in 2019, which we published in 2020 for the first time. But we gathered insights from lots of other bits of research, and there was a study done by the Dart Centre, I think it was from 2017, and it was unscripted producers, and they touched on bullying and harassment. And there was this one case study from a managing director of a fairly small production company, and he used to say at the beginning of every production, this is what you do if you experience bullying or harassment, inappropriate behaviour. This is the person you go to. If I bully you or treat you badly, this is who you go to. And it was absolutely standard, and he would expect, if he wasn't there and someone else did it. And you keep saying it, you keep doing it every time. That's something that Kate from Call It, I just caught my eye there, was saying the other day about their app. You think about it like a fire extinguisher. You have to keep saying it, because 99 times you won't need to use it. But then it becomes normalised, and then when you need to use it, you know what's there. And I think flipping that, making it normalised, making it something you talk about a lot, is, I don't know, I'm slightly uncomfortable when you said, how can you open up the conversation that says, what have I done wrong? I mean, that's quite an awkward conversation to have. but setting the tone in that if this happens, it's okay to talk about it. This is the kind of space that we want to work in. Those are things that I think are worth trying.
Is there anyone else? I can see someone over there.
Hi, I'm Krista Van Raalte. I'm from Bournemouth University. I've done quite a lot of research around areas like bullying and harassment, some of you will know, and also management. And I think two things I want to ask really. One very much follows on from the previous speaker, or it's sort of connected to what the previous speaker was saying. And a few times we talked about, well, what happens? What are the outcomes? And, you know, I think we know it's really important that people see some outcomes, because otherwise, you know, anybody who's done work in this area knows people will say, well, the reason I didn't report it is I've seen what happens, nothing happens, so da-da-da. But I think people need to have a really clear sense of what the end game is. Some people won't report because they actually don't want anything that terrible to happen. They want something just, I want a rap on the knuckles here, I don't want him to lose his job, or, you know, whatever it might be. And so that lower level stuff, and the lower level stuff's really important, because the lower level stuff's the stuff that normalizes the culture, makes the worst stuff happen. People won't report the low level stuff because they don't want to, sometimes for themselves, right? But sometimes they don't want to get someone in trouble. So I think, so one question is about how can we sort of make it really clear that there is a sliding scale of what happens to people, right? Everybody doesn't get thrown into the, you know, pit of boiling oil or whatever it might be. That seems quite important. That sort of graded response, particularly what Lucy was just saying, you know, in that context, you know, what happens if somebody, and, you know, you get into this awkward space about informal and formal, and at what point can you just have a conversation that goes, you know what, maybe we don't do that, you know, because sometimes there is a place for that, and you sometimes need to reassure people, not just that nothing terrible is going to happen to them, but actually nothing terrible is going to happen to their friend and colleague, as the previous speaker said, who is a bit out blind. So I think there's something about that. What do we do with that? And my other question is about managers. And I've done a lot of work with, yeah, inverted commas, middle managers, because nobody in telly considers that to actually be their job. And I mean, Lucy's made some really good points about that. Like you say, it's not all training. These soft skills are really hard to teach. But I think there's two problems, there are many problems. There's two specific problems in television, it seems to me, that come out around managers at that kind of mid-level line manager, which is that, putting aside the fact that they might not really have those skills, but they don't know the most fundamental stuff, like it's not legal to do that. They really don't know equal opportunity is a thing, you know, whatever, fundamental stuff. Why would they? Because they got that gig because the last show they did was really good, not because of anything else, right? And the other thing is, so, you know, they don't know those things. Sometimes they know they don't know them. Sometimes they don't know they don't know them. And they also have this challenge, if they do try and do anything, that quite often their own superiors aren't letting them. So one of the things that came out with conversations I've had with managers was that where they did feel there was a well-being issue in the broadest sense and try and do something, they're getting a slap on the wrist for that, and then they feel they haven't got the time allocation to do those things, and they aren't appointed for those skills. So there's a lack of valuing those skills. Those aren't skills that are going to get you another job. Those aren't skills that anyone is going to have any respect for, time for. And so what that leads to is, why develop them, assuming there is training? Yeah, but you're a freelancer. Nobody's going to pay for you to do it. You've got to pay to do it. And why would you do that? Because nobody values it anyway. I think there's an issue around. So how do we get people, what can we create structurally? Because no, we're just nagging people, right? How do we create a system where actually we do have people in those line manager positions who do have some vague idea about what they ought to do, and maybe even some training in how to do it? How do we actually set that up?
I don't know who wants to go first. Kind of two things. It's that I'm regretful to call it lower level, but more informal responses, and then the second with the kind of middle manager. I don't know if. On the slap on the wrist kind of thing, I think this is something that we need to get more research on, Anna, and I'm desperate to do this with you, because
my experience from running the advice line, and we've been taking calls for 4 years, and we do every single sector you can think of, right? My understanding of it is actually, they're probably not going to get fired. They're probably not going to feel that much consequence. And it's a thing that women say to us all the time. You know, I don't want him to be fired. I don't want him to be. And I have to say, well, you know, I'm thinking he's probably not going to be fired. He's probably going to be nowhere near fired. Women have to go through so much just to get a slap on, to, you know, achieve a slap on the wrist. That for me, I think it's a bit of a myth that, like, I don't know what the right word is. It's not a myth, but it's something I think conditioned into us, which is, you know, don't make a fuss. You know, this is sympathy in action, right? Like, you know, he deserves to have benefit of the doubt in a way that we don't do for other things. And I think that's a problem. I think we need to kind of look at, like, why is that our reaction? On a kind of moral sense, but obviously, from the perspective of an employer, you're still liable, you're still on the hook. Nothing has changed just because that person is willing to kind of, you know, maybe just accept a bit less than somebody else. And I think as well it's problematic that we should kind of put that onus on the woman, saying, you know, how far should we take this? Why should it be specifically up to that woman? That's not fair. I think everyone should come to the system and have access to the system to the full effect of it, not how willing they are to have conflict with this perpetrator or the organisation, because that's not fair.
And one good practice example in the report of this, which exactly this was, you know, a young man reported another young man who had assaulted him at a work event, and he said, I don't want him to lose his job. The employer said, well, you know, actually, you know, with all due respect, that's not up to you. We need to uphold the standards of behaviour in the workplace, so we're going to look into this and make that decision. And it was wonderful to hear that. And he, you know, the interviewee accepted this response. And I thought, that's so rare for an employer to say, okay, we are going to uphold our standards of behaviour. So it's our responsibility to, you know, to decide what action we're going to take. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
Yeah. And you know, people get fired for a lot less. They get fired, you know, for a lot less. So I think this is a particular, you know, sensitivity when it comes to this issue and not being, you know, knowing how to handle it. And you know, I think it's going to take a long time before we get over those issues. But I'll leave the freelancer part to people more experienced than me.
Cool, those are difficult questions. I mean, I wish I had the proper answer. The first one, how do we, the slap on the wrist stuff, that's where the beauty and the that's why you want to have the good managers who can handle those things locally, informally. And you create that culture of, you know what, it's going to make a healthier culture if it's okay to say to someone, look, I don't want this to go any further. I just think you should know that so-and-so said that thing. And also we need to recognise, we talked about the difference in generation. Someone who's, you know, in their, you know, 50s, 60s, really might not have meant to offend. I'm talking about the lower level stuff here. And there should be a way, as you say, to be able to have that, take that person aside and say, actually, that made that person feel really uncomfortable. It doesn't need to go any further, but you need to acknowledge that and to be able to handle that. But it's really difficult to create that environment. And so I think that sort of brings me on to your next question is, what's the incentive to have people, to reward and to have people who have that good HR? And again, I'm afraid it's the more research is needed. But, you know, there's lots of evidence out there, and there's Deloitte, and we cite evidence all the time about the cost of having unhealthy practice. What is the added value of having really good practice? That's really hard to measure. And our head of our research team is sitting in front of me, and I can see his head exploding. But it is really hard to measure. It is something that we're trying to look at. That is a really exciting area of research, because that is what is going to motivate people in business, is if you can say, this is going to be better for your bottom line. If you're mitigating your psychosocial risks later on the line, you're going to save time, you're not going to have conflict, you're not going to have the risk to your reputation. You can look at those negatives, but if you can build a case where you can say, actually, if you spend money, if you want to attract people and it's worth skilling them up, because it will pay off in terms of the quality of your output, in terms of your profit. That's really exciting. We're working on that. I think more people should work on that. I think that would be a really, and I hope CISA can work on that as well. I think that is an area that is ripe for study. Anna, I don't know what you've got on next, but there's an idea for you.
I'm just conscious of the time, so we've got time for one more quick question. There was a woman over there who had their hand up.
This question is for Anna. Hi, Anna. I'm wondering if you can spend just a second reflecting on the role or appropriateness of a kind of feminist political framework or a political feminist framework as it might pertain to this piece of work. And I'll just say one thing before that. There's a lot of stuff here that has been brilliant, thank you, and that I've been percolating on. And I suppose I'm particularly interested in how a kind of critical feminist framework might pose some quite important challenges to some of the discourses that are embedded here. For example, how we might kind of, through a critical feminist make a move from sexual violence and sexual harassment towards sexual harm, or another kind of expanded concept of harm. How we might think about transformative justice or even abolitionist discourses when it comes to punishment and kind of the police and criminality. And then also kind of how we might, or what the possibilities might be in terms of making a move away from a hierarchy or a kind of sliding scale of kind of behaviours in which kind of some are seen as less important or kind of less serious than others. What about feminism?
Oh, thank you, Rachel. And I should also mention your important research on sexual harassment in drama schools, if you don't mind. Basically, there's the wider context of gender inequality as a cause and consequence of sexual harassment, and I think there's a route towards this kind of incremental change and speaking to industry, and therefore using the levers and tools that the industry understands, that kind of makes sense in terms of incentives. And so that's kind of what I've been trying to do in this report, rather than taking that wider critical lens. Because, there are points where you do just want to scream and want to burn it all down. I think one of the really exciting examples that I heard about in the research, which gave me kind of hope, and which I think provides some framing for what you're doing, are examples of women-led feminist organisations that were actively embedding an anti-sexist culture and anti-racist culture in their work. So I've kind of talked about different types of organisations in relation to how, in the report, in relation to how gender inequality manifests in that organisation. And so these kind of anti-sexist organisations appeared to be pretty rare. And that was about kind of actually, thinking about what a positive culture looks like from a feminist perspective. How can you create that, and then embedding that into everyday practice? And I know there are, feminist filmmakers and leaders in the sector who are wanting to do this work. And so I think it's finding those examples of exciting, positive, anti-sexist practice. And learning from those organisations, similarly to what Lucy was saying.
The amp started making the weird squeaking noise again, so I think we can wrap up there. I will remind you guys that this study is at the back there, along with some extra resources from Film and TV Charity, etc. So please do kind of take a look at those. And I believe there's a reception, and would you like to say some thank yous?
Yes, some quick thank yous. I think there's John Swords at the back who made this report happen. It's his fault, blame him, from the Screen Industries Growth Network. So thank you very much for your support throughout this. And I think Rowan Ost is here, who's been supporting me and providing feedback on drafts. Thank you so much. Thank you very much to Percy Warren for help with the publicity for the launch and for the report. And of course to Rupert and the team from the Film and TV Charity. And of course to the panellists for an excellent discussion today. I feel like we could have carried on for hours, and I kind of want to, but we better not.
How brilliant were these guys, so say thank you to them. Cool.
So I think there are going to be drinks available. There are going to be drinks available at the bar tea, coffee, wine, beer and non-alcoholic drinks. So please do stick around and do come and talk to any of us if we didn't get a chance